So today I'm going to tell you, as Stefania said, about our work at NIST in Boulder, about synchronizing a microwave clock to an optical clock over free space. So all of Peter's hard work makes actually a quite nice introduction to what we've done here at NIST. This is a picture of Boulder, Colorado, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit us. And just as a quick reminder, we're going to talk about synchronization today. So here's my cartoon picture of what it means to have two clocks synchronized. They're ticking at the same rate and they're reading the same time because timing information is passing back and forth between them, and the master is forcing its behavior on the remote clock, and Einstein here sees that they agree. And we're interested in synchronizing clocks at the femtosecond level over the air for a lot of reasons. You could be interested in the distribution of time and frequency information, precision navigation and timing, long baseline interferometry, building coherent sensors, phased arrays, testing fundamental physics. And I think as the talk after me will talk about, fiber links are amazing, but they're not always practical and possible. As mentioned in the first talk this morning, if you want to cross continents, it's very hard to do that over fiber. You might want to go, as Peter mentioned, to a satellite, some sort of airborne platform. If you want your clock to be sitting on a moving vehicle, even on the earth, it's awfully hard to connect a fiber to that truck as it drives down the highway. And you might want to go to places where fiber isn't available. So we need to be able to synchronize clocks over free space links at the level that supports the best optical clocks that are out there. And this is really hard, and Peter touched on one of the reasons why it's really hard, and that's that we have to go through the turbulent atmosphere, and that causes loss of signal. And as he mentioned, there's this piston effect that causes path length variations. And we know how to handle part of that, which is that we're going to use a single mode link, and we're going to go two-way via an exchange of pulses. And so conceptually what this looks like is on each site I have a clock, and at each site, when they think it's time 0, they launch a pulse. And then at some time later at each site, I detect that pulse. So over on site A, sometime later that's equal to the propagation time plus a little bit that's due to the fact the clocks are running at different rates. I measure the time and I do the same thing on site B. And if my link is fully reciprocal, which for our links we're close to the ground, we're going single spatial mode to single spatial mode for a static platform, they are truly reciprocal. I can take the sum or the difference and I either get the time of flight between the clocks, which is the same for us in both directions, or I get the time offset between the clocks. And this is great because I can remove any of the path length variations that are caused by turbulence or the building swaying, in our case, up on the rooftop of the NIST building. And I want to go beyond this, though. Not only do I want to do a comparison, but I actually want to synchronize my clocks. So I need to make that measurement still, but now I need to communicate from the master site to the remote site and do that calculation in real time. And then I need to be able to apply feedback to my remote clock at a fast enough rate to keep the performance of my remote clock where I want it to be. And so we know how to solve the problem of turbulence by doing this two-way exchange. And the next problem comes down to the fact that we want to do our synchronization at the femtosecond level. We want to be able to generate an output of our clock at a performance that is comparable to the underlying oscillator on the master site. And so the solution to that is that we use a frequency comb. And this is a common theme of the rest of my talk, is anytime there's a problem, we just stick another frequency comb in the system, and it always makes it better, as long as you're good at building frequency combs. So this is our clock, and I'd like to point out that we are concerned here with relative time scales. We're generating an optical time scale, but we're not tying it to an absolute reference at this point. So here's our master clock. We have a frequency comb that's tightly phase locked to a cavity stabilized laser. And this comb is at a 200 megahertz repetition rate, so it outputs ticks at every 5 nanoseconds. And we have a controller that counts and labels the pulses. And we define the arrival time of the nth pulse at some reference plane as noon with an awful lot of digits. And so what this means is you can look at this picture and see, well, if we want to do two-way time transfer with an exchange of pulses, well, hey, I've got a bunch of pulses right here with femtosecond level timing, so I'll just do my two-way time transfer with frequency combs. So now on each site, I have a master frequency comb over here, phase locked to a clock, and a remote frequency comb over here, and they generate pulse trains. And so at time 0, they each launch a pulse 5 nanoseconds apart, and I'll just detect those, and that's great because the comb timing is at the femtosecond level. So it seems like I've solved my problem, except the timing information gets lost in the photo detection. If you do direct photo detection, you're still at the picosecond level. So that brings me to sort of our third problem, which is how do we detect these pulse trains that are coming out of my frequency comb and preserve that femtosecond level timing. And as I told you, the solution is, of course, we use a frequency comb. So we use an approach called linear optical sampling. And this is great because now, well, I offset my master comb output by a little bit. And now at each site, I can do a heterodyne measurement, which is great for signal-to-noise regions, and one pulse train walks across the other. And I can measure that cross-correlation or interferogram. And from that, I can extract the timing information of the underlying pulse train and get sub-femtosecond uncertainties. And we did that a couple of years ago for a test of a clock comparison across a free space link. But it's a little bit awkward to say you're synchronizing the outputs of your clocks if your clocks run at different rates. You can have some sort of virtual synchronization, but it's not clear. So the solution, obviously, is you just keep adding frequency combs to the system. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use a transfer comb to be able to compute the difference in pulse time, arrival times at 3 different locations while maintaining an output and each site that is running at the same frequency. So this transfer comb runs a little bit offset, but the master and remote combs, which are going to generate my clock outputs, run it the same way. And there's no equation there. That's interesting. And down here, we compute the in-loop time offset from these 3 heterodyne measurements, as well as some numbers we compute from a course to a time transfer measurement. And while there's no equation here, we could, using a quiet optical cavity at the remote site, synchronize 2 clocks to within 20 femtoseconds over 50 hours. And this is also appearing in a forthcoming PRX, whose reference does not appear on the screen. So what I want to tell you about today, though, is not about synchronizing to a quiet optical cavity, but instead, can we make the remote site a worse clock? Can it have poorer performance? In other words, can we use a microwave clock? There's a lot of reasons you might be interested in using a microwave oscillator. They're smaller, cheaper, more robust. This is our cavity in here for our cavity stabilized laser. It's in an isolation chamber at NIST. And it is true, you can purchase things that are much smaller than this, so I'm a little bit cheating with this picture. And here's a scaled down version of our breadboard quartz stereo microwave oscillator. And you might want a microwave output at the end of the day as well for your actual measurement, and so having a microwave clock on your remote site is very convenient. So how do you get there? Well, in the remote site, you just reach in here and you remove the cavity stabilized laser and replace it with a quartz stereo 10 gigahertz oscillator. In reality, that's a lot more complicated, but for time reasons, I removed the slides that show you all of the different signals there. But the cool thing about frequency combs is that it's pretty straightforward, actually, to either configure your frequency comb so you're phase locked to an optical reference up at 195 terahertz, or to lock to a 10 gigahertz signal. And at the end of the day, you still have an output that looks the same. You have these ticks that are spaced by 5 nanoseconds. We're still doing the exchange of pulses in the optical domain. And so to do a test of this system, we set up a folded 4-kilometer path at NIST in Boulder, and we send all of our in-loop signals across the free space link, and we have a little short link between the master and remote sites where we can verify by doing an out-of-loop measurement how well we're doing at our synchronization. So what that looks like in reality is, here again is NIST. We're up on the 5th floor of the NIST building. Here's a mesa behind us, which is very convenient. We have a big mirror up here. So here's our free space terminals. They have very small telescope apertures that are well matched to the atmospheric turbulence. As Peter talked about, we don't necessarily win by having large telescopes. And we go out through a window, off a giant mirror, in through the window, off a giant mirror, back out again, and back into the other receiver to do a 4-kilometer path. And our control electronics are here, and we have 1, 2, and 3 frequency combs sitting up here in the lab for our detection. So in cartoon form, this is what it looks like. We have 2 frequency combs, again, on the master site, both phase locked to a cavity-stabilized laser. On the remote site, we have 1 frequency comb phase locked to a quartz stereo system. And we also have a modulated CW laser system for the course ranging and timing. On the remote side, of course, we have to compute this little tiny delta t down here is a lot of work, especially on Hugo Bergeron's part. We have to compute how we're doing, what the in-loop time offset is from all those comb measurements, and then we have to do the processing and determine how to correct the remote clock. We have two different outputs of the system now. We have a optical pulse train that gives us our time output, the ticks of our clock. We can also take the 10 gigahertz out of our system and look at the frequency output. And we did both of these. We did an out-of-loop verification, both looking at the overlap of the ticks of our clock, the 200 megahertz pulse train, and measuring the differential phase noise on those 10 gigahertz outputs. And for technical reasons, it was actually 10.037 gigahertz. So this is what the time output looks like. So the top trace here in black is the time offset measured over an 8-hour period, looking at how well we're synchronizing the remote and master clocks. And this is averaged in a 1-second window. So mostly what you're seeing here, this is the pulsing of the air conditioning in the lab, us trying to keep temperature control with the windows open. And that's the sensitivity of the out-of-loop measurement fiber. It's about 2 meters of fiber to the room temperature. You can also see in the blue curve, this is how often we get to make a measurement in a 1-second window, the percent of the time based on what we should expect. So this is the fact that because of atmospheric turbulence, we do see interruptions of the signal. It doesn't impact the timing measurement, but it means we don't always get to make the timing measurement. Most of these dropouts, these periods where we don't get to make a timing measurement, are very short. 90% of them are below 10 milliseconds. But there are periods where we don't get to make a measurement. And down here, for those of you who are interested in atmospheric turbulence, this is the turbulence strength we measure across our link close to the ground in Boulder, Colorado, sort of moderate levels of turbulence. Apparently at 3 p.m. it got very quiet outside. And so from that time output, we can compute a time deviation. And here, there are two blue curves on here showing the time deviation for our system. And I'll explain that in a minute. But first I want you to note this is 10 femtoseconds here. So from the synchronization bandwidth out to 1,000 seconds, we see a time deviation for both cases below 10 femtoseconds. What we're seeing here is this dark blue curve is sometimes when we look at all the time. We do our verification measurement 100% of the time, even during those rare periods where we lose the signal for more than 10 milliseconds, up to a second, 10 seconds, which happens but not very frequently. And that pushes this time deviation up. Our system knows about when we have a time measurement across it, so we can look instead and only look at our verification when we have active synchronization, which for some applications might be how you operate the system in an end-user fashion. And that's what we call gated operation. And here you can see actually for a lot of the time it comes down below 1 femtosecond in the time deviation. And this was our previous optical measurement here, where we used a remote optical oscillator. As I said, we can also look at the frequency outputs of our system as well as the time output. So this is taking those two 10 gigahertz signals we're generating and looking at the differential phase noise. And the first thing that we did actually was we didn't lock the system, and we just looked to see basically how far the remote clock was walking off from the master optical oscillator. And so this purple curve here is the free-running microwave clock, and what you can see is at low Fourier frequencies, this after the 4 behavior, that's the random frequency walk you would expect. And if you integrate this up from the synchronization bandwidth out here at 100 hertz, all the way up to 100 microhertz, you get a timing jitter of about 2 nanoseconds. And if instead we hit lock on the synchronization system, and we go over 4 kilometers, you get the red curve, and you can see at low Fourier frequencies, you see a very dramatic suppression of the phase noise, of the timing jitter. And that's because of the fact that we have this very tight active synchronization. The bandwidth is very high here to account for the fact that the microwave clock is noisy, and so we push the bandwidth up to 100 hertz to account for that. You can see that we do see an increase here. There's a little bit of difference between the dark gray and the red curves. And that's the fact the dark gray curve is if we don't go over the air. And because of the fact that occasionally there are these rare periods where we see interruptions of our signal, that does give us some white noise that comes up, but it's still quite low. And if you wanted your phase noise out here to be lower, then you have to go talk to Frank Quinlan and Scott Diddams about doing a better job of optical frequency division or microwave generation off of your clock. We can also take that 10 gigahertz output and compute the frequency instability. So this is, again, looking at the comparison between the two 10 gigahertz outputs and computing the modified Allen deviation. And this is looking at all times, so including those periods when there are excursions of the microwave clock due to a lack of active synchronization. And the cool thing is what we see is at a second, we see the modified Allen deviation crosses 10 to the minus 14, and out here at 1,000 seconds, we're below 10 to the minus 17. So in conclusion, we can see femtosecond level synchronization of a remote microwave clock to an optical clock over 4 kilometers of turbulent air. And this is 4 kilometers of turbulent air close to the ground across the whole path length. And we can see sub-femtosecond synchronization at very short time scales if we look during just periods of active synchronization. And these clocks stay synchronized to within plus or minus 13 femtoseconds over the whole 8-hour measurement. And when we look at that phase coherent 10 gigahertz output and integrate that timing jitter down to 100 microhertz, we're only seeing 6 femtoseconds. And when you look then at the modified Allen deviation, what that corresponds to is a instability of 10 to the minus 14 at 1 second and below 10 to the minus 17 at 1,000 seconds. So we think this is really promising for being able to synchronize smaller and more compact microwave clocks and tie them back to the performance of at the level of really good optical cavities or of even the best optical clocks. And hopefully this will expand the range over which we can control our clocks.
Thank you. Time for one quick question.
So it is the time deviation. It is computed from we're sampling actually the out-of-loop verification. It's computed from that out-of-loop time series of data. So we're measuring our time series of data. We actually sample at 5 kilohertz, the time offset between our clocks. So we have a time series. I showed data that had been, the time series to reduce the fuzziness, I showed it at a 1 second window, but we actually have data much faster than we accumulate data much faster than a millisecond. And how offset our clocks are, because we have a tick of our clock every 5 nanoseconds, so we can see very fast.